Good morning, everybody. My name is Toby Cadman. I have served as the defence lawyer for Abdul Mollah since January 2011. I had hoped to appear before you this morning with a different banner calling for saving the life of my client, but unfortunately we have been informed at 10:01 this morning, Dhaka time, he was executed. I can only say this is a deplorable act by a deplorable government. I have spent the last more than 2 years trying to ensure that my client receives a fair trial. He has not received a fair trial, and he has now been summarily executed under conditions that I can only characterize as being judicial murder. It is deeply regrettable that the government of Bangladesh has not heeded to the numerous concerns and warnings by members of the international community in order to make this process fair. The government of Bangladesh has repeatedly stated that this process meets the highest international standards, and actually the former Foreign Minister, Dipu Murni, actually told a member of the US Congress that Bangladesh was setting new international standards. Clearly, all of these statements are utter nonsense. It has been a farce from the very beginning, and it is with very, very deep concern that it has come to this stage. Over the course of the last 3 days, there have been statements from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, by Secretary Kerry, by members of the UN, including Ban Ki-moon, the Prime Minister of Turkey, representatives from the United Kingdom government, from the House of Lords, and I learned this morning that the chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights from the European Parliament wrote to the Prime Minister yesterday requesting that this process falls under international jurisdiction. The government has rushed to judgment. They have executed a man in breach of all international standards. As many of you will know, I've spoken very critically about this government over the last 2 years. The result of that was being thrown out of the country and not being able to return. It has been very difficult to represent the interests of my client, and I have had to rely on a very capable team in Dhaka that have done their very best to protect the interests of this man. We do not consider this a failure on our part, because everything was stacked against us. This was a process that was predetermined, that has been used as a political tool for this government to cling on to power. As many of you will know, there has been a UN delegation in Dhaka for the last few days trying to ensure that an agreement is reached, or a compromise is reached, between the two main parties so that there is a proper election on the 5th of January of next year. The statements that have been made by the international community that this execution will in all likelihood derail that process, and it will be highly unlikely that any election can now take place. It is our fear that this is the intention of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, to create chaos, to declare a state of emergency, and to postpone the elections indefinitely and cling on to power. Again, I consider this to be a deplorable act. I would also like to say the international community has to take responsibility for what has happened today. I have repeatedly warned them of the consequences of what today will bring. I am very fearful for all of Bangladesh now, for what will happen on the streets, the violence that will inevitably ensue. That again is deeply worrying. I have made a call to those that I represent and the supporters of those that I represent to ensure that there is no violent response on the streets of Dhaka and across Bangladesh. We would hope the government exercises the same level of restraint and allows the supporters of my client to peacefully demonstrate on the street without being targeted, as they have repeatedly been so, by the security forces. And I would like to remind the government that their response to this is now under the watchful eye of the international community, particularly the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She will be watching this carefully. Bangladesh is a state party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and what happens now falls under their jurisdiction. The government is responsible for what has happened. The government will have to take responsibility for what follows. And I can say today that, once again, this is judicial murder. This is not a process aimed at justice, accountability, or reconciliation. This is going to tear the country deeper apart. And no stone will be left unturned in ensuring that those that have caused this are brought to justice. That is a promise that I can make. Now, I'm sure many of you will have questions. My presentation obviously is shorter than I had envisaged, but today, what has happened today is deeply shocking for our team and for the family of Abdul Mollah. What I would also like to say, we have just learned before coming in that Mr. Mollah's son has been arrested and that the government is refusing to release the body so that they can have a funeral under their beliefs. This again is a deplorable act by a deplorable government, and the international community can no longer sit by and take no action. Bangladesh has been supported by a number of strong nations, both economically and politically. Questions now have to be asked as to whether that support continues, whether diplomatic relations can now continue in the same light. It is, of course, the people of Bangladesh that will suffer from any action that's taken, and again, that's deeply regrettable, but the government only has themselves to blame for what might follow. My last message will once again be to the people of Bangladesh to ensure that this does not descend into chaos and violence, that the government does not respond with the usual heavy hand that they have responded in the past, and to ensure that members of the international community who are in Dhaka, who will have to try and resolve this matter, are not targeted. That is the request that I will make. The leadership of Jamaat Islami, who I represent, issued a statement today. They issued a statement several days ago calling for peaceful demonstrations. Let's hope that the government does not create chaos and put this on the responsibility of Jamaat, because once again, it is the government that is responsible for what follows. Thank you very much. I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Whatever they are doing now, today or tomorrow, one day they will get out from the power. So do you have any plan to future against those people, judges and attorney, whoever bring false witness? Do you have any plan to take action against them?
I would say, firstly, it's not for me to take action against those. It will be for the government who is in force to decide what action should be taken. But I would also say that the culture of revenge and retribution has to stop. It will not help to continually prosecute the former leaders. The future of Bangladesh will never recover from this unless there is a proper system of justice, accountability, and reconciliation. What I can say is what we have prepared here is a plan for how a system of justice and accountability should look. Please take a copy, have a look. I'm an international lawyer. I specialize in international criminal law. I specialize in ensuring that justice and accountability is brought. I fully understand that the level of victimization during the 1971 War of Liberation is such that there has to be a judicial response. But there has to be a long-term transitional justice process that is devoid of political interference. Now, what I can also say is that if there are those members of the government who have directly interfered in this process, that have caused witnesses to perjure themselves, that have conspired to pervert the course of justice, that is a criminal offence. And those people should be brought to justice. But again, that is not a question for me to answer. That is a question for whoever is in power to answer. Now, we have heard statements from the leadership of the BNP that if they come to power next year, they will ensure that this is an internationally supervised process. We have to ensure that they keep their promise. We have to ensure that it is an internationally supervised process. And I can tell you that my discussions with the international community, including the United Nations, have said they would welcome an invitation from the government of Bangladesh at any time to be able to conduct a proper review of this process. And what I will say to you now is that in January, if there is a new government, the first step should be to create an international inquiry of this process. All of these trials have to be reviewed. Now, for Mr. Abdul Mollah, it is regrettably too late. Whatever review will have little value to him and his family. But I would hope that he is the only one, out of all of those who face trial, that loses his life. I oppose the death penalty in all circumstances, for any crime, because it is irreversible and mistakes cannot be rectified. But there has to be a process that reviews all of these cases and determines who is responsible. Because I'm not saying to you that it's a question of if. There is plenty of evidence to show that this process has been manipulated by members of the government from the very beginning. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of who. But that international inquiry has to be credible, not be manipulated by politics, be represented by the international community, and to make recommendations to the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, as to what further action should be taken. But I would also say that Bangladesh, the current government, will also have to respond to whether they should remain members of institutions like the Human Rights Council and the Commonwealth. Because these institutions stand for upholding human rights. And again, this is deplorable conduct by a deplorable government. And they cannot continue to benefit from membership in bodies and hide behind those bodies any longer.
Thank you for a wonderful answer.
You have a lot of experience in international criminal tribunals. To what extent you see Bangladesh tribunal is different compared to other international tribunals?
Well, it doesn't compare to any other tribunal. It is in a black hole. Unfortunately, being in the US, I would say the only tribunal potentially that it could compare to is Guantanamo. The situation with the Bangladesh tribunal, it's not an international tribunal. The name would suggest it is, but the international in its title is only because these are crimes under international law. So then the question that has been repeatedly raised is it a national court? And it's not, because it falls outside of the ordinary constitutional hierarchy. There are constitutional provisions that remove fundamental rights. Due process rights are removed in the Act itself. And we have seen the manner in which these trials have proceeded over the last 2 years. And there is no tribunal, no war crimes tribunal that compares to such a farcical process. Now, I have refrained repeatedly from adopting the language of others that it's a kangaroo court, but it's very difficult to actually distance myself from that when it's very difficult to defend any act that this tribunal has effectively made. The problem that we have is this is probably Bangladesh's last chance to deal with this problem. Defendants will become too old, witnesses are dying. It is very difficult now to wait another generation before this is dealt with. So, again, leaders of the opposition, if they're elected in January, have to take a very hard look at this and determine the manner in which this process should be set forward. I do not believe that if the opposition comes into power, they should merely shut down the tribunal and release everybody, because that will serve no purpose. There has to be a process of accountability, but these individuals have to have the opportunity to properly establish their innocence before a credible tribunal. So I can't compare it to anything else because nothing else compares to it.
I got one quick question. We lost an innocent person based on your statement, and you lost 2 years, the process. Now, as far as we know, there are several other people online, they're on the pipeline,
Yes.
going through this process. So we did not save this person because of whatever. What international group has a plan to save others? Because we could not save whatever the reason,
Yeah.
but we need to do something, take some action, measure to save others, because they are on the pipeline and they are in the same status. I mean, all the evidence so far they provided, and you know, and many people know, and it's clear, obvious, those are wrong, false,
Yes.
and created by government. So now, international people, group, whatever, human rights, they have a responsibility, as you mentioned. So what are the things they are planning or taking action under consideration to save these people?
Certainly. Okay, I'll start by saying I will extend my deepest regret and apologies to the family of Abdul Mollah for not being able to save his life. I have done, I think, everything within my power to try and stop that. I said the international community now has to take responsibility because the international community has failed, and has failed the people of Bangladesh. There needs to be a coordinated effort now to deal with this diplomatically with the government of Bangladesh to ensure that no further person loses their life. The next case in, as you say, the pipeline is Saidi. His trial was probably the most flawed trial out of all of them, because a prosecution witness who turned and became a defense witness because he refused to lie for the government. And as you know, he was abducted on the steps of the tribunal and disappeared for 3 months until he was found in prison in India. It has been very difficult to understand why nobody cares about what has happened in Bangladesh, because we have seen scandal after scandal. And in my statement, which you're all entitled to take, I actually say any other judicial process would have collapsed long ago, and probably the government with it, for supporting such a process. So it is deeply worrying. In terms of what can be done and what should be done, you need to look at who has responsibility for this. So if the situation descends into chaos, as we fear it might, then this will fall within the jurisdiction of the United Nations Security Council, because this may then become a question of regional stability. And it will become a question of regional stability if the violence, as is expected, starts as a result of this decision. The UN Human Rights Council has, in my view, the responsibility to call an urgent session on Bangladesh to take some kind of action. And again, countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union needs to take this seriously and to consider their diplomatic relations and economic relations with this current government. So those are the bodies that have responsibility. And nobody wants anything that is going to affect the ordinary people of Bangladesh. There have already been innocent civilians who have died either by being caught in the heartholes or being targeted by the security forces. Enough is enough. We cannot allow for innocent civilians to die. there has to be a response to prevent that from happening. And if that continues, then appropriate action, whether it's the International Criminal Court or another body, will have to take responsibility. Now, I can't give you the easy answer as to what will happen, but I have to hope and pray that the international community sees what this government has done by committing judicial murder and take action appropriately. Okay, well, as I say, there are no further questions. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. And again, I take absolutely no pleasure in delivering this news to you. Thank you.
Just before we conclude, a few words. I just spoke with Mrs. Abdul Mollah before he was executed, and definitely she's a brave woman, and she was talking without stuttering. All we can do now is pray for his departed soul. It's a very unfortunate thing that happened, but he left a legacy that would last long. So let's all take a moment and pray for his soul, so that definitely he rests in peace. And my final word would be to people who loves Mr. Abdul Mollah, that you do your demonstration, but definitely avoid violence, because violence is never an answer. Use as much restraint as possible. Again, I would like to thank you all for coming, and God bless.